Hi, my name is Mary Sue Haydt, and today I'm going to talk to you about some rules for designing secure medical equipment. So, in my talk, I'm going to start out a bit telling you why security is important in medical devices. Then I'll go through 5 rules of embedded security, and then we'll give you a conclusion. So, the reason security is so important in medical devices can be found in headlines all over the place. This set of headlines is focusing mainly on the US, but the same problems are reported worldwide. So the first is a report of Log4j, which you may have recalled from last fall. It has been discovered as a cybersecurity potential vulnerabilities in all sorts of embedded devices, and of course, certainly in medical devices. The second one is an outside consultant or hacker, however you wish to view them, deliberately tried and indeed find vulnerabilities in hospital robots. Fortunately, these weren't surgical robots. They were the kind of robots that deliver drugs and equipment around a hospital, but still rather scary. Another one was a report of multiple cyber attacks in different configurations. This reports both denial of service, ransomware, and attempts to compromise hospitals' data systems. And if we look at the others, indeed, they're talking about a flaw in monitoring software. This actually wasn't in the device. It was in software that works with the device. And finally, everybody sits there and goes, well, ransomware, well, that's bad, but it just makes you not able to access things. Well, if that thing you can't access is a hospital or a doctor's office, then it becomes a matter of life and death. So it's very important that we maintain cybersecurity here because ransomware attacks can lead to death. So in the light of all of these attacks and detected vulnerabilities, there have been a series of evolutions of requirements for medical devices. The leader worldwide in this is the US Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration provides guidance for various things in medical devices, and there is an entire publication of guidance just on cybersecurity. In fact, there are 2. In 2014, they issued the first final guidance for pre-market submissions. Pre-market submissions are the documentation package that is submitted to the FDA for a new medical product. And this set of guidance said, when you consider your safety analysis, you need to consider the impact of cybersecurity issues. Is it possible for a denial of service attack to take your system down? And if so, is there danger to the patient? Now, I have seen recently, as of April 7th, there's a new draft version of the guidance. So that's the updated version. It's about time for one. We're 8 years in. In 2018, in addition to this guidance on what needs to be in the design of a new device, there's an additional set of guidance issued for post-market management. So post-market management refers to the maintenance of the device. So this is talking about any update procedures, and what your rules are for triggering an update. And this guidance is on how to make that also secure. Now, one of the problems with these documents from the FDA is that they're described as guidance. What does guidance mean? Exactly what it sounds like. Basically, here's what we want you to do, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. So if we then look at, is there anything that can help someone who hasn't worked with this system before? The answer is yes. Underwriters Laboratory in the US has issued a standard, UL 2900. UL 2900-2-1 is specifically for medical devices. And this is a standard that implements the above guidance. Now, what that means is this is a list of requirements that if you follow, you should be able to implement everything in the above guidance. This standard is also issued by the American National Standard Institute as ANSI 2900-2-1. Now, I recommend, though, looking at those. They're all American standards, but this will enable you to pretty much certify your device in any country in the world. The US standards are some of the highest. If you'll look at the EU MDR and MDCG are very similar. You have processes that meet one, you will probably also meet a certifying body in the other. Now, one of the big differences between the EU and the US has to do with where their priorities lie. The US priorities are very much focused on safety of the device and patient safety, the device itself. The EU, on the other hand, focuses more on data security. So one of the things to watch out for in the EU is that data security violations can trigger fines that are quite high, and those can go to the medical device manufacturer, not to the operator. So it's very important to get your cybersecurity right in both environments for both things. So when you look at your network device, you might sit there and say, my medical device is only going to be used in a laboratory. I don't have to worry too much. It'll be on a nice, safe network. But in reality, medical devices aren't partitioned off. The assumption you've just made can be valid for industrial devices. And if you're used to designing for there, you might be able to make that assumption with a lot of caveats. But if you assume that a medical device is not connected to the internet, that's probably not correct. Doctors, nurses, therapists, patients themselves all want to see their data. And they're going to want to use apps that are convenient to them. So they're going to be using their cell phone, or they're going to be using a terminal somewhere, and they're going to take a look at it. And, well, you're connected. The other thing that can happen is you're going to sit there and say, well, the only thing I do over the internet is updates. I do them safely. And that's possibly true, but remember, that connection is going over the global internet. So if there happens to be malware running around, a virus or whatever, your medical device is now subject to exactly the same attacks that any corporate network can be subjected to. So we need to make sure that your system is secure. Okay, so we've talked about why security is important in medical devices. Now let's talk about the 5 rules of embedded security. These are guidelines you always want to keep in mind as you're developing your system. So the first is to communicate without trusting the network. Again, we've just shown you there's all kinds of nastiness out there. The second is to ensure that your software is not tampered, that no one has injected malware into it. The third is to protect critical data. We talked about why critical data is important, the fines in the EU, the general embarrassment of getting an FDA bulletin against you. Secure keys reliably. The keys are the foundation of your system. And finally, operate reliably. So we've said that we need to make sure that we know what's on the network, that we can trust everything on the network. Why? Well, network attacks are often done by accessing the network or any other device on the network. And that attack may come through the internet, but it can also come through any other access port, such as a USB stick or a debug port. Is JTAG live on your system? Do you have a COM port that might be used as a console? Those sorts of things are still in your system. When it goes out in the field, you've got a potential area for a vulnerability. Now, once the attacker is in a vulnerable system, they can then look at the whole network that system's attached to and figure out a way to attack a more protected device. So you've got to watch out that your system is not that weak link, and you've also got to assume that it's possible that some other device nearby that's old, perhaps is running Windows 3.1 and has a bunch of vulnerabilities that have never been patched, that device could be taken over. So we've got to look out for that so that the network stays secure and certainly so that your system is secure. Now, how we do that is by authenticating all endpoints on the network. Now, by all endpoints on the network, I mean all the endpoints within your communication. You're assuming that there are bad agents out there and that there are bad points on the network. What you want to do is to use the public key infrastructure to communicate with your known good endpoints. Now, when we're using public keys, there are certificates that are generated by reliable certificate authorities for each device. And that's a way that the devices know, yes, that's a certificate I am supposed to be working with. Yes, I can communicate with you. Here's my certificate. Yes, we can communicate with each other. Yes, we're good. When we have those certificates, we can then create the keys and to authenticate each other. And those keys we can use then to encrypt messages and to ensure that no one else can understand them. So we've got a good system of keys. Now that's all software we're running from the bottom up here. Now that's great. So we've got a system, but you know what? We need to make sure that the software we're running is our software. After all, if somebody has put something else in there and that can take advantage of our stack that knows all of our certificates and all of our keys, well, they can then use our system as a place to do malware, to do something evil to the network. So how do we do that? Well, let's take a look at a typical software stack. And we're going all the way from apps all the way down to the operating system. Now, how does the operating system know that it's itself, that it's the correct version, that nobody's modified it or some device drivers, that the apps are good to run? Well, generally speaking, it knows it assumes when it boots. Okay, good. So how does the bootloader know that the image that it's loading is a good image? Well, ultimately, you need a secure bootloader, not something that's just going to pull an image and load it and say, good, we're ready, let's go. The secure bootloader is going to use hardware features in your system. In modern SoCs, there are the components that a secure bootloader needs built into the hardware on the SoC. So you want to make sure you're using those. Most of the SoC vendors also provide a secure bootloader, or they permit you to use others. But that's what you need. You need to make sure that you go down to hardware to get the fundamental elements of the key. So those will be common. We can use those certificates. That also will give you a unique device identifier as well. And here we go. We have a secure bootloader, and we are booting based on hardware assistance. For older processors, this hardware may be off chip. Just a warning. Now, if the bootloader is good and we boot it power up, then everybody that boots out of that can, if it is doing all of its proper checks and everything, then you know that your software is indeed the software you wanted. Now, there was a time when you flashed or programmed your applications, your system once. When you built the system in the factory, you did it once and you sent it out in the field. If it had to be updated, you needed to send a technician out, or maybe you needed to bring it all the way back. But that's not the case anymore. Now people have applications that do that. And so those applications use the update. Now that update application had better have been installed by this secure bootloader so that you know it's good. It's going to use all of that chain of trust that we just showed you all the way down. It knows it was installed by a secure bootloader. It starts itself, and it will then use everything of that chain of trust to reload the software. And that could be anything, including middleware. Don't worry that there's a line missing from the drawing. Okay, so we now know that the software we are running is our software. How do we structure that software? Now, we could have vulnerabilities either from a problem in our own code or from some third party. So what we want to do is to minimize the impact of a vulnerability. And that's done by separation. So separation is the key. We want to separate out critical components, and not only their code, also their memory. If they are exclusive users of a particular piece of hardware, we want to separate that out too. If not, we want to make sure that that access is secure as well. So all of these things require that they are separated with strict access controls, and that way we can achieve high security. If you've been hearing talks about safety, you'll have heard very much the same story because separation is common. Now, how do we do separation? Ultimately, we need a separation kernel that is a secure and safe RTOS. The operating system, the separation kernel, allows various applications with mixed safety and security levels to run on the same processor. What the separation kernel will provide is to ensure that those lesser safety or lesser secure items don't interfere with the more critical ones. Now, in some cases, the application that you've developed or applications, you've got a bunch of non-critical ones, and they may have been developed, say, on Linux or some other operating system that's huge and difficult to secure and difficult to make safe. And in that case, you can run the entire system as a guest using a secure hypervisor and run the as secure and safe applications directly on your main separation kernel. This enables isolation and protection of sensitive data. It'll secure interference from outside. Now, remember, you're the designer. It's important that you minimize connections between these secure and insecure sections. Watch out for that debug stuff. Watch out for JTAG, USB. Now, when we look at the requirements of the RTOS, it's fundamental. It has to be reliable. Also has to be deterministic. You think of deterministic in terms of safety, but also is important for security. There are a lot of timeouts in, say, an IP stack. And if somebody can stall you out long enough, cause enough retries, you've got a denial of service. So make sure that your operating system itself is deterministic. Now, safe, secure, and deterministic, 3 characteristics you need in your separation kernel. And these can't be back engineered. They've got to be designed in from the front. If you don't design your system with these 3 in mind, what you'll find is if you try to add it later, you keep adding and adding and adding, and you keep reducing the probabilities of failures, but you can't get them down to 0 because you didn't think about it from the front. So it's really important that you use a safe and secure RTOS, like Green Hell's Integrity. Now, a little bit more, here's a picture for that separation. For those of you who are more visually oriented, the separation kernel enables you to separate out critical applications, critical drivers from non-critical. Now, that block in the light blue that says a virtual machine monitor can be any application. You can have, in this case, a hypervisor. So you've got all kinds of applications running on a guest Linux. Or you could just have non-critical or non-safety critical items running on as well. All of these are kept separate from your critical application by the separation kernel. The separation kernel does not just protect the code space, it also is going to protect memory. It'll protect resources, shared memory, for example. You could here have memory shared between the critical device driver and the critical application, and that's never visible out to those applications running on Linux. So the separation kernel enables you to protect critical data. So we've designed a secure system, but one more thing that we need to do is to manufacture it in a secure way. And so that means that we need to take a look at what's called your security infrastructure, not just how you design the system, how it'll be used in the field, but how it's going to be programmed. And what that means is that how are you going to get the keys, get the certificates into your device on a network, because we're still on a network. So once again, that is another secure network that's required. And we're going to look at that as basically the same thing you just did on your system, you must also do within your company. Now, as a designer of embedded systems, that's probably not your role, it's someone else, but you need to make sure that this security infrastructure is in place. And that'll generate the keys and certificates and program them in the devices. Now, when we look at a secure system, there's a rule about secure systems, and when they're done properly, a system is secure if everything about the system is known except for the private key. That's why keys are so important. If that key is known, then the system is no longer secure. So we need to be very careful about protecting those in the manufacturing as well as in operation. In a typical manufacturing flow, the keys are injected at the very end. And so that's where we really need to be connected to the internet, but also to do it securely. Now, where this gets tricky is in manufacturing, there are usually many manufacturing sites all over the world, and not all of the code may be from headquarters here. It may be from partners, third parties. Remember, we've got that insecure code that's running on Linux out in the guest. And in that case, code to update that. How do we get through this whole path? Now, it can be done, again, if your security infrastructure is in place. But if you don't have a good security infrastructure in place, then and your third party updates something, then you've got a question as to whether your end system is secure. All right, so we've got everything, all of those components in place. There's still one more place where we've got to watch out, and that's that we have to operate reliably. Now, to operate reliably, we have to develop securely. And so, first off, we need to build on a secure foundation. And some of the elements of a secure foundation, we talked about a good separation kernel. But then as a designer, I have to use that separation kernel properly. And one of the things to watch out for here is least privilege. We only want to give applications access to peripherals and shared memory and other address spaces and so on that they need to have. Don't open the whole system up. Don't let everything talk to everything. Don't use default settings that are that way. Build a system on least privilege. The next two things for reliable operation complement each other. We componentize our code so that we've got individual blocks. And one of the things that you'll find when you do that is least privilege. This block doesn't need access to that block, so I can separate it off. Each of those components should be small enough that it can be tested and validated in its own standalone space. And to do that, the system needs to be as simple as possible. Complexity makes it harder to see all of the possible ways that your system could be compromised. So let's keep them simple. You need to develop in a secure environment. So that's things like making sure your code repositories are secure so that someone can't get your source. And there's one piece I like to emphasize, which is independent expert validation. It's very important that you, who've been designing it, gets other eyeballs looking on it, on your system. That's important to make sure that your system is indeed secure. If you happen to notice what Green Hills practice is, we have certifications from a variety of certifying bodies for many different things. And that's to ensure that someone else is looking at what we're doing. That's really important to develop a secure system. And a little bit about bugs. So none of us is perfect. Every system has bugs. We're showing some cases here where even after QA, you've got a reasonable amount of bugs. Now those bugs, some of them are harmless. They print out a lowercase letter instead of an uppercase letter. But some of them are security vulnerabilities. So if we look at examples in the real world, these are known vulnerabilities. And this is old data, but it's still valid as far as what kinds of things you'll see. So many vulnerabilities are not yet known, and those are the worst. So if you look at a car has an amazingly large number of lines of code, 50 million lines of code, and this was a few years ago. So this is probably up by a factor of 10. And even if you've got a small number of vulnerabilities per 1,000 lines of code, with that many lines of code, there are 2,500 vulnerabilities that would be discovered in that platform in 5 years. But there's even more that are not discovered until somebody comes along and boom, finds a way to get in and creates a zero-day attack. So this is why when you develop, you need to have this secure view of development. You need to be thinking about componentalization. You need to understand how your components work. You need to keep them simple. And you need to have separation to avoid a vulnerability that was found in one place from impacting the security of another. So now we are developing securely as well. So let's look back. As a conclusion, I want you to look over your system and see what is your weakest link. This is a good fence, great chain, good size padlock. Oops, the chain broke. I'm going to ask you, that little white tie wrap is clearly the weakest link in this system. Got to go back, take a look at your processes, take a look at your system, and take a look at where is your weakest link. Thank you.